I'll go ahead and get started. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Keith White, and I'm a meteorologist here at the National Weather Service in Austin, San Antonio, as well as our Climate Services focal point. And today, we're going to talk first a little bit about what happened over the course of the last several months, review the summer. Another active hurricane season ongoing has spared South Central Texas, but we did have a wet summer followed by a dry September up until the other night. We'll talk about the forecast conditions for La Niña to develop later on this fall and through the winter, typically leading to warmer and drier than normal conditions for our area, with some exceptions. Lastly, this morning, some minor drought and abnormal dryness was expanded across our area with the latest issuance of the drought monitor. But with wet weather this week, should see some pretty quick improvements with next week's. So first, real quickly, we'll talk about a look back at summer, specifically meteorological summer, which is June, July, and August. Astronomical summer, as many are familiar with, of course, being around June 21st or so through about September 21st. And for much of our area, it was rather wet. After a dry spring, kind of flipped a switch there in about the end of August, and it's been very wet the end of April. And from the end of April through much of August, it was rather wet across the majority of our area. You can see at our 4 climate sites, the only of the 4 that saw below normal precipitation or near normal precipitation in August or through the summer was San Antonio. But as you'll see on the next slide, that was just due to the single point of data collection there. And it was actually rather wet around most of the region. So here is a map of estimated precipitation over the 90 days covering June, July, and August. And you can see that especially over the eastern half of the area, a lot of locations saw 1.5 to 2 times as much precipitation as is normal for this time of year. And because of the antecedent wetness in late April and May, increased soil moisture can lead to increased humidity and cooler daytimes as more of the sun's energy goes into evaporation of that moisture rather than heating. And that is indeed what we saw throughout the summertime. Much of our region saw daytime highs near to below normal. Well, overnight, that increase in moisture led to cloudier nights and early mornings, and that kept our overnight lows through the summer actually above average, despite the fact that the averages as a whole were actually slightly below normal this summer. Looking back at rainfall just over the last month, 2 months, 3 months, and then 6 months, you can see where we've had generally very dry conditions across the area over the month of September, except for those areas that got a lot of rain the other night here, Tuesday night, between Austin and San Antonio, and then up into northwestern Gillespie County. But elsewhere, especially right along the Rio Grande, less than a quarter, even less than 10% of the usual rainfall for the month of September. Over longer timescales, you can see that wet summer creeping in, although even over those longer timescales, right along the Rio Grande is still seen below normal precipitation for much of 2021. It does remain to be seen exactly where and how much rain will fall in the short term here through this weekend. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So let's look at climatological fall here. These graphs, many of you will remember from previous Outlook presentations, although they've been updated with the new 1991 to 2020 normals values. You can see the bar graphs here showing a secondary peak in precipitation in the September-October period. Our primary wet season is going to be in the spring, especially in May, but we're sort of entering a secondary wet period climatologically, and of course we're on the decline in terms of temperatures. Average temperatures will continue to fall, and we'll see some hopefully more comfortable conditions as we head through the month of October and into November. In terms of severe weather and flash flooding, we also do sort of have a secondary peak here in flash flood reports, and this graph covers all of the reports received between 1955 and 2019 for tornadoes, hail, and thunderstorm wind. Only goes back to 1996 for flash flooding, but you can clearly still see that typically the month of October shows a secondary peak in those flash flood reports. Although severe weather, well, we do see an increase in October versus, say, August and July, still relatively low, especially when you compare it to our primary severe weather season in the spring, particularly with respect to hail, when we have these giant bars here for March, April, and May for hail. Only 100 or so historical reports of hail in the month of October. So not super favored, but still something to think about with our patterns in the early part of the fall. Then we do typically dry out as we head into the winter, and we see fewer reports of severe weather by December. Looking at the short-term outlooks, this was issued yesterday for essentially the second week of October. It does look like after we get through this wet period here over the next few days, we're looking at an outlook that leans towards higher chances of above normal temperatures and drier than normal conditions as well, especially over South Texas for that second week of October. And then, of course, this is actually just hot off the presses in the last hour, the latest quantitative precipitation forecast over the next 3 days, this evening through the weekend. And it looks like most of the heavy rain should be confined to our Rio Grande locations that have seen some dryness over the last both 1 month and 6 months. They should be able to handle a decent amount of rainfall, but and this could put a dent in that lingering drought in that area. But areas to the east could only be looking at now a ½ inch to maybe 1.5 inches or so of rain. And some locations may not see a whole lot of rain at all, through the weekend. We'll talk a little bit more about what that could mean here in a few minutes. As we look at the longer range through the fall and into the winter, our conditions do have at least some teleconnection to the La Nina El Nino cycle. Last winter was, of course, a La Nina winter, a moderate strength La Nina. We have since re-entered ENSO neutral conditions. However, a La Nina watch is in place, and it does look like a high likelihood of a weak La Nina will return late this fall through the winter, likely to be relatively short-lived. As soon as we push towards the spring, this February, March, April, looking likely that we'll be returning back to ENSO neutral as we head towards the spring. This graph here on the right just shows some of the individual models and then the ensemble mean and the official forecast of where the sea surface temperatures in the tropical Eastern Pacific will be as we head through the fall and into the winter. And squarely within this range of ½ degree to 1 degree below normal in Celsius, of course. So a weak La Nina, and there's a new product this year that the CPC produces, which is sort of probabilities of the strength of El Nino, and you can see very high probabilities of this weak La Nina, as we head through from October to December and then into the winter, likely then returning to an ENSO neutral state by the late winter, early spring of next year. Still not out of the question that we could see a more moderate La Nina event, a 39% chance of that occurring in the November, December, January timeframe. And these numbers will be updated in about 2 weeks' time, once a month on the second Thursday of each month. So typically, La Nina years are going to be drier and warmer than normal across much of Texas when taken as a whole. Of course, there's always going to be periods of cool and wet weather. And like we saw last winter, you can still see very anomalously periods of cool and wet weather, like we saw last February. Of course, not expecting anything like that over the course of the next 3 months. One of the ways we can look at this information is historically. And this just really quickly aggregates all of the past La Nina years and shows how many of them essentially were cooler or wetter or warmer or drier. And so on the left for temperature, across South Texas, especially deep South Texas, there's a higher chance for warmer than normal conditions based off of our historical La Nina years, with a lower signal the further north into Texas you go, and sort of the same goes for precipitation as well. A higher chance for drier than normal conditions across the Rio Grande, especially. But still a decent signal across the rest of Texas. And those numbers in each zone here refer to the opposite end of the tercile. So a 20 here essentially means that 20% of the years were actually cooler than normal. A 10 would mean just 10%, and the same goes for this here. 20% of the years were wetter than normal in our coastal plains areas here. So we can say, not with any certainty, but with at least some confidence, that we're leaning in the direction of a warmer and drier winter based off of our historical data. But we can also look at models. And I've chosen specifically to focus on the CFS model because it's updated very frequently with recent data. The North American multi-model ensemble shows some similar information. However, I've chosen not to show it here today simply because it has not been updated in several weeks. An update is due relatively soon, and so I'd like to stick with as much recent data as we have. And of course, this model is showing a pretty good chance for positive temperature anomalies through the end of December in South Texas. On average, 0.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, which is 1 to 3 or so degrees Fahrenheit. And in terms of precipitation, that signal doesn't exist over our entire area, but it does look like it's focusing in on an area of dryness along the Gulf Coast, just to our east, for the months of October through December. So the Climate Prediction Center takes, of course, model data, previous, analogs and other information into account, and they come up with their longer-term outlooks. The first of which this one is just for the month of October, and you'll note this was issued September 16th. There is an update to this due out sometime today, ideally in the next couple of hours. So I do encourage everyone to take a quick peek at the CPC website, either later today or tomorrow, to see how this will change. But as of mid-September for the month of October, we're looking at odds leaning slightly in the direction of those warmer conditions, as well as drier, with that signal highest, of course, over our southern Edwards Plateau areas. As we extend that out through the end of December, pretty similar. Like we've talked about, warm, dry. Now, this also, in addition to the La Nina conditions, this is also compared to the last 30 years of data. So with anthropogenic global warming, superimposed on the internal variability, even without a La Nina year, odds are already slightly tilted towards above normal temperatures. In this case, with La Nina forecast to occur, those odds are increased slightly, about 40 to 50% chance here for temperatures being above normal, and the same for precipitation being below normal. Drought, like I talked about at the top here, this morning's outlook expanded abnormal dryness across a pretty large portion of our area, but that did not take into account any of the rain that fell on Tuesday night. And of course, it didn't take into account any of the rain that has not yet fallen, which largely will likely be focused out across these areas that could use the rain the most. So we'll see what this looks like next week, but there will likely be some changes to this. In terms of the drought outlook through the end of the year, with that likelihood of warm and dry conditions, the Climate Prediction Center does expect that even though some of this will be eliminated next week, that in the longer term, we will probably still be looking at some expansion of drought through the fall. Of course, it's impossible to say exactly how severe or where could see the worst conditions. A lot will depend on shorter term forecasts of precipitation than what we can say with any certainty at this point. Lastly, we'll talk a little bit about fire weather. So of course we do have some short-term dryness across the area. Some areas already saw some precipitation, like I said, on Tuesday night, pretty beneficial rainfall of 2 to 4 inches in many areas, and as much as 6 inches. Out west along the Rio Grande, it's definitely been drier. Not necessarily super high Keach-Byram drought index values compared to where we'd be in a typical year, but certainly elevated and worth watching for any locations that are already dry and may potentially miss out on precipitation over the course of the next 3 days or so. Those would be some areas to watch if they do remain dry for as cold fronts come through the fall and winds pick up. The potential for perhaps some areas to watch in terms of fire weather. Energy release components are falling back towards normal over the east part of our area. All the recent rains from Tuesday night have really dropped those values from above normal back to near or even below normal. Out west, though, still above normal dryness across the Western Hill Country and South Texas areas. Not shown, the National Interagency Coordination Center outlooks through the end of the year do call for near normal wildland fire potential for the state of Texas. And lastly, just to show you where those areas are that the Texas A&M Forest Service drew those graphs for, they do cover areas outside of our South Central Texas counties, but are still generally representative of what we're experiencing here. And then lastly, hurricane season. We're already past the peak, and at least for the state of Texas, kind of starting to think about putting a wrap on things. We're not entirely out of the woods in the month of October, looking at the historical records. A few tropical storms and even a couple of hurricanes have made landfall in the state of Texas. But right now, there's nothing on the horizon that the National Hurricane Center is watching. And with each passing day, any impacts from tropical systems become less and less likely for the state of Texas. Thankfully, we missed out on any impacts really this season. Hurricane Nicholas, of course, coming the closest to our area, making landfall in southeast Texas, but with its wet side on the east, we really didn't see many impacts at all here in south central Texas from that system. So just to wrap things up, of course, a lot remains to be seen on how much rain is going to fall here over the next couple of days. A little bit more rain than we're expecting, and maybe we could ratchet up these slider bars here a little bit for our risk of heavy rain and flash and riverine flooding. As of right now, though, with the September dryness, our soils are in pretty decent shape across much of the region. Rivers aren't running very high, and so we don't have any expectations of a whole lot of issues. That said, though, all it takes is one really heavy rain event. Some of you in the San Antonio area in particular will remember July 5th of this year, 6 to 8 inches of rain falling on the northwest side of town, and some pretty significant flash flooding resulted, as well as a flood wave working its way down Almost Creek and into the San Antonio River. In terms of fire weather, likely near normal impacts from wildland fires. Recent dryness in some areas will bear watching if they're not able to pick up much rainfall. And then lastly, in terms of tropical weather, below normal impacts are expected at this time. An above normal Atlantic Basin hurricane season continues. There's only one name left on the primary list before they would move on to the secondary. But of course, very rare to get those systems impacting us here in Texas as we head through the month of October. So with that, thank you all for joining me today. I'll be available for any questions. This recording will be posted to our YouTube page and emailed out to the same list that received the invitation. And of course, anytime you can reach our office or you can email me as shown here if you have any specific questions or needs. So thank you all for joining me today, and I hope this was helpful for you.